Is that a hammer? Are you kidding me? General Kaz's voice rumbled through the hall, eyes fixed on the figure before him. The human at the center of the room barely looked up, his hand tightening slightly around the handle of his hammer. A tool worn smooth from decades of use, his arms were thick with muscle, his skin marked with faint scars and burns, each a quiet testament to long hours spent over an anvil. But to Kazul and the gathering of alien military leaders, he looked like nothing more than a relic from an old, irrelevant era, a curious decoration from Earth, a planet they'd seen as primitive and underwhelming. The legends say humans have weapons that cut through the darkness of space, sneered another commander, scaly and thin with narrow eyes that flickered from the hammer to the man holding it. But here stands a supposed warrior with a hammer. Is this all Earth's deadliest has to offer? The blacksmith's expression was impossible to read, but a faint twitch in his jaw hinted at something sharper. Hidden beneath his silence, his name was Brody Cars, a man who had earned his living crafting weapons, Earth's old-fashioned weapons. Axes, swords, hammers, the sort of tools that in a more advanced age seemed as outdated as fire-making to the alien generals. It was laughable to those who knew Cars. It was terrifying, but the aliens didn't know him. Not yet. Cars lifted his hammer, seemingly admiring its weight, as if the scrutiny of the alien leaders didn't faze him. Funny thing about a hammer, he said, voice low and steady, like embers heating beneath a forge. It doesn't ask who it's about to hit, doesn't need to be fancy, just needs to be strong enough to finish the job. The generals exchanged looks, smirking at each other, some barely containing outright laughter. To them, the human was little more than an ancient relic of war, a curiosity. You are far from home, human, General Kazul remarked, grinning, revealing rows of serrated teeth. His voice was laced with both arrogance and the cruel satisfaction of having the upper hand. Your quaint little rock of a planet may be resilient, but out here we do not rely on hammers. He chuckled, his words thick with condescension. No! Our battles are won with weapons of true sophistication, with fleets that blot out the skies, technology that turns planets into dust. Cars took in the general's words as if they were nothing more than a soft breeze brushing past. He'd met countless men, human and otherwise, who overestimated themselves because of their fancy weapons and shiny ranks. He wasn't impressed then, and he certainly wasn't now. You're right, he said almost lazily as he turned his gaze toward the walls of the grand hall, where trophies and weaponry from countless planets were displayed as a testament to the Coalition's conquest. Out here, your fleets rule. Out here, you've got ships that can wipe out entire colonies without touching down. The generals leaned forward, almost eager to hear what else the blacksmith would admit. They thought they'd broken him, reduced him to humble reverence, but out here, he continued, a dangerous glint in his eye, you've also forgotten what real battle feels like, what it's like to get close enough to see the whites of your enemy's eyes, to feel the crack of bone under steel, or for that matter, under a hammer. The room fell silent. There was something in his tone, a quiet intensity that rippled through the alien leaders and cut through their smug satisfaction. Kern's words held no bluster, no wilds, just an eerie calm that even Kazul found unsettling. Kazul waved a clawed hand, dismissively attempting to restore his composure. We no longer need such barbaric methods. You humans cling to relics, to outdated notions of battle. But tell me, blacksmith, how many ships have you felled with that hammer of yours? Carr shrugged, a faint smirk creeping into his expression. Ships? Not many. He paused, a shadow flickering across his face. But I don't usually go for ships, I go for generals. This drew a low murmur from the crowd, their previously mocking expressions shifting. Cars wasn't grinning, wasn't taunting. He was stating a simple, chilling fact, and as much as they wanted to laugh it off, there was something about his demeanor, something that felt out of place in a man who was by all appearances just a blacksmith. An officer near Kazul shifted uncomfortably, clearing his throat. Perhaps we should rethink. Nonsense, Kazul interrupted, his voice booming. This human poses no threat. He was brought here as an amusement, a display of Earth's talents. He emphasized the word with a sneer, his gaze darting back to Kearns. We allowed you here, human, as a show of our generosity. Kearns met Kazul's stare, his grip on the hammer steady and resolute. Generosity, he echoed, his voice just a notch louder than a whisper. Interesting choice of words. The room felt cold, older. Somehow the general sensed it too, though none would admit it. The human's presence, his audacity to stand there without a hint of Fear was starting to irk them, yet they couldn't understand why he hadn't shown even a flicker of intimidation. Most humans they'd encountered crumbled under their authority, reduced to pleading for mercy or concessions. Not this one. Kazul leaned forward, folding his hands as he narrowed his eyes. You find something amusing? Blacksmith Cars tilted his head, a faint chuckle escaping him. Oh, it's amusing, all right. The mighty generals of the Union sitting around boasting about their ships and technology, and yet none of you have even asked why a blacksmith would be standing here in the first place. The silence thickened, curiosity mingling with suspicion. Another general, his scales glistening with a faint iridescent sheen, glanced at Kazul. Why is he here? Kazul, wasn't this meeting supposed to be strictly military? Kaz's gaze flickered momentarily before returning to Cars with renewed intensity, a token to showcase Earth's so-called best. I thought it would entertain the council to see a relic of humanity's past before we move on to more pressing matters. Carnes grinned, a sharp, unsettling expression. And it hasn't disappointed, has it? Kaz's claws twitched, an indication of barely contained annoyance. If you were truly Earth's deadliest human, you'd have brought more than a hammer. Karn shrugged. You see a hammer, I see a tool with a purpose. Another alien one with shimmering blue skin and elongated limbs let out a harsh laugh. And why don't you show us what your little toy can do? Human Kearns's eyes shifted to the speaker, his gaze unfaltering, unblinking. You wouldn't want that. Not here, Kazul sneered, gesturing toward the armored guards lining the hall. And what would you do against them? Human, your so-called weapon is no match for our defenses. Carnes regarded the guards calmly. Guess that depends on what you think a hammer is good for. There was a tension now thick and pressing that even Kazul couldn't ignore. His hand went up, and the guards shifted in response, taking a single step forward, each with weapons drawn and aimed directly at Cars. The room bristled with anticipation, every alien's gaze fixed on the lone human at the center of their assembly, the one they had brought here to mock and humiliate. Cars remained unmoved, his voice calm and unwavering. Drifted through the silence. Funny thing about hammers, he said slowly. They don't care what stands in their way once they swing. All that matters is impact. The guards didn't move, but Kaz's fingers tightened ever so slightly, a subtle signal. Cars took a small step forward, just enough to close the distance between him and the nearest guard. The alien shifted uneasily, his grip on his weapon faltering as Cars raised the hammer ever so slightly, just enough to make the alien flinch. Come on, Kearns said, a low challenge in his tone, his eyes locking with Kazul. Let's see just how confident you really are. Kaz's eyes narrowed as Carr stood defiantly before him, hammer in hand. The general could feel the tension rising among his own soldiers, each guard gripping their weapons tightly, as if they were faced with a threat they couldn't comprehend. He almost scoffed at their nerves, one human holding nothing more than a tool, yet Kearns's quiet confidence was like an itch they couldn't scratch, a spark of unease that refused to be ignored. You think you're clever, don't you? Kazul sneered, attempting to regain his composure. All this posturing, this arrogance, you're trying to unsettle us. But we know better. His voice grew louder, aimed as much at his own men as at Kearns. You are a single human in a room filled with the galaxy's finest, nothing more. Kearns shrugged, a faint smirk on his face. Just a blacksmith, he said. Funny thing is, I thought you'd know better too, thought you'd have the sense to understand what you're dealing with. The general bristled, his composure slipping. Oh, we understand plenty. What you don't understand, human, is the might of the Union. We have conquered species across dozens of systems, crushed empires twice as old as your little world. You think a hammer intimidates us? Kearns tilted his head slightly, his gaze unwavering. A hammer isn't meant to intimidate. It's meant to break things, weapons, armor, bones. That silence that followed seemed to stretch on forever, every alien in the room feeling a chill that was hard to explain. Kazul, though, felt his pride prickling, a stubborn refusal to let a human, a blacksmith, no less, hold any sway over him or his forces. He raised his voice again, rallying his men's confidence, though it sounded more like he was convincing himself. If you think you can frighten us with outdated Earth tools, you're more foolish than I thought. Human Kearns's smirk didn't fade. Maybe I am foolish. Maybe I'm just a simple guy who happens to know a lot about how things break all sorts of things. He looked Kazul dead in the eye, and for a moment his gaze was as cold as iron. People, strategies, empires. The sneer on Kazul's face faltered ever so slightly, but he forced himself to hold steady enough. Of this game, he barked, Turning to his soldiers, he gestured sharply. "Seize him, teach this human that his place is beneath us." The first guard reached out, but Carr's arm shot forward with a speed that defied his size. The hammer's head connected with the guard's wrist in a blur, shattering the armor plate with a brutal efficiency that sent the weapon clattering to the floor. The guard's shriek of pain cut through the hall as he staggered back, clutching his broken wrist. The other guard, thrown off by the sudden attack, raised his weapon, but Carr's was already on him. A single precise swing to the kneecap, and the guard crumpled with a howl, his leg bending at an unnatural angle. The remaining soldiers shifted weapons, drawn, unsure whether to advance or retreat. Carr straightened, meeting Kaz's gaze once again. "You know it doesn't take mud," he said, his voice calm but carrying a razor-sharp edge. "You armor up, build your weapons, think you're invincible. But it just takes one swing in the right spot to bring it all down." Kaz's face twisted with fury, his confidence teetering. This is madness. A human blacksmith? How dare you challenge us?" Carr gave a slow, grim chuckle. "Blacksmiths know a lot about challenges. Ever worked a forge, General? Not exactly comfortable work, but it builds a certain kind of strength, and out there," he jerked his head toward the stars, "strength doesn't come from sitting on a high-tech throne. It's forged in the grit and sweat of every battle, every struggle for survival. But that's something you wouldn't understand." The room was heavy with an oppressive silence. Kaz's officers, some of whom had started the meeting with laughter in their eyes, now watched Carr's with wary expressions. The man had laid out two of their own with nothing but a swing of his hammer, and he hadn't even broken a sweat. But Kaz's pride was a stubborn thing, and he clenched his fists as he stepped forward, clearly unwilling to admit any weakness. "Enough of this," Kazul spat, his voice shaking slightly. "Or alone, outnumbered and outmatched." Carnes finished, arching an eyebrow. He chuckled again, that same low, quiet laugh that grated on Kazul more than any taunt. "I'll let you in on a little secret, General. I've never once needed a fancy weapon or a fleet to get a job done. Not when the right swing and timing will do the trick." Kazul clenched his teeth, his patience wearing thin. He glanced around at his officers, silently commanding them to strike to finish the human once and for all. And yet there was a moment's hesitation, an unspoken doubt that had settled over the room. Carr's noticed it, his smile widening. "Scared, are we? Thought I was just a blacksmith, just a simple human with a simple tool enough," Kazul roared. "I refuse to let a primitive mock the might of the Union Guards finish him." The remaining soldiers hesitated, looking at one another, then back at the blacksmith, their expressions filled with something that resembled fear. Karn's eyes traveled over each of them, assessing, waiting. The silence stretched, and then with a resigned look, one of the guards lowered his weapon. "I've seen humans fight," he murmured, casting a wary glance at Kazul, "and I'm not paid enough to stand in the way of a warrior like him." Kaz's face flushed with rage. "Cowards, spineless, pathetic cowards. The lot of you." His voice trembled LED with frustration as he turned his glare on Carr's, his anger boiling over. "You may have bested a handful of guards, but you are still just a man with a hammer." Carr's lifted his hammer, letting it rest casually on his shoulder. "Maybe that's all I need to be," he replied coolly. "Or maybe you're the one who never understood what it takes to be a warrior. It's not about rank or armor or fancy weapons. It's about knowing how to finish the fight, even when it looks impossible." Kazul snarled, his hand moving to the weapon at his side, a sleek, serrated blade that glinted under the lights. "If my guards won't finish you, I will." "A general does not allow a challenge like this to go unanswered." Carr's merely shrugged, not moving, as if Kaz's threats were no more than the idle buzzing of a distant insect. His eyes, however, never left Kazul, and the steel in his gaze was unmistakable. "Then come on, General," he said, voice low and taunting. "Show me what the mighty Union's finest can do." Kazul's hand tightened around the hilt of his blade, his anger swelling as he glared at the human standing so calmly in front of him. The general was tired of being toyed with, of this primitive creature daring to challenge his authority. His pride, his reputation, and his command over the other officers now hung in the balance. Carr simply waited, hammer resting on his shoulder, his expression unreadable. He wasn't boasting, wasn't flinching. He was just there, quiet and steady as a mountain. The other officers, guards, and attendants in The hall watched the two with bated breath, every second stretching painfully. With a low snarl, Kazul lunged blade, flashing as he closed the distance. The weapon was made from rare alloys capable of slicing through the hardest known materials in the galaxy. It was meant to end this quickly to prove his dominance and silence any doubts, but Kern's sidestep was surprising agility. His movement smooth and practiced, the hammer swinging down like a comet. Kazul twisted narrowly, avoiding the blow, but the air rang with the force of Kern's swing, and several nearby soldiers flinched instinctively. The general spun around, blade at the ready, but Kearns was already advancing, his eyes locked onto Kazul, focused, relentless. "You're fast," Kazul sneered, masking his surprise, "but you're still just a human with a piece of metal. This ends now." He lunged again, fighting to the left before sweeping his blade toward Kern's side. But the blacksmith's reaction was immediate. He met the strike with a powerful swing that deflected the blade with a clang that echoed through the chamber. Kazul staggered back, his arm jarred by the impact. But Kars didn't stop. He pressed forward, his hammer cutting through the air in a series of brutal arcs, each swing perfectly timed, each movement purposeful. Kazul struggled to block, his confidence eroding as he realized he was being pushed back step by step. This wasn't some clumsy assault. Kars wielded the hammer with terrifying skill, his strikes precise, his grip unwavering. And the human wasn't tiring. If anything, Kar seemed to grow sharper, his movements accelerating with each strike, as if his entire life had been leading to this moment. The assembled officers watched, their shock growing as they witnessed their general, one of the II's finest, struggling against a man wielding nothing but a hammer. A few of them began to murmur, voices tinged with disbelief and fear. They had underestimated this human, dismissed him as some quaint relic of Earth's past, but now watching him, they realized they'd made a grave mistake. The room was deathly silent. The other officers, once smug and arrogant, now stared at Kars with a mix of fear and respect, the reality of the human's prowess settling, and he had taken down one of their best without a single scratch, with nothing more than a hammer and an iron resolve. Kars looked down at Kazul, his voice calm, almost gentle. "Like I said, General, a hammer just needs to be strong enough to finish the job." Kazul glared up at him, his pride shattered alongside his bones. "You think this changes anything?" He spat, his voice weak but defiant. "The Union will never fear humans. You're nothing but insects compared to our might." Care shrugged, the beast hint of a smirk crossing his face. "Maybe, but if one human with a hammer can bring your best to his knees, imagine what a whole planet of us could do." He left the hall, his footsteps echoing through the stunned silence. A single human who had reminded the Union's finest that strength wasn't found in metal or machines, but in the will to survive, to fight, and to endure.